What if I told you that the main threat to ancient humans was not predators or enemy arrows, but ordinary rain? In a world without synthetics, plastics, or central heating, wet clothes meant not just discomfort, but a sure path to hypothermia and death. The Native Americans of the Great Plains and forests of North America lived under the open sky for centuries, facing down downpours, snowstorms, and biting winds. They did not have membrane fabrics or rubberized raincoats, but they stayed dry where modern tourists would get soaked to the skin. Their secrets lay not in magic, but in a deep understanding of the properties of natural materials and the laws of physics. Watch the video to the end to learn how ordinary smoke turned leather into a waterproof shield, and why the fringe on a jacket is not a decoration at all, but a complex engineering system for water drainage. Want to learn a secret that will change your perception of ancient leather processing technologies? We are used to thinking of campfire smoke as nothing more than a pungent smell and watery eyes, but for Native Americans, it was a key chemical reagent. Raw leather that has simply dried in the sun becomes as hard as wood and instantly absorbs water at the first sign of rain. To turn the skin into clothing that could withstand the elements, it had to be specially treated with smoke. This process changed the very structure of the fibers at a microscopic level, making them resistant to moisture. Without this step, any jacket would turn into a soggy rag within an hour of being caught in the rain. The smoking process was long and required tremendous patience and attention to detail. The sewn skin was hung over a pit in which specially selected rotten stumps or cones smoldered. It was important to maintain a low temperature so that the skin would not boil, but would be saturated with thick smoke. The smoke penetrated deep between the collagen fibers, enveloping them in resinous substances. This created an invisible film that prevented the fibers from sticking together when wet. The smoking could last for several days until the skin acquired a characteristic golden brown hue. Different tribes used different types of wood to achieve specific colors and properties. Willow produced a light shade, while walnut stained the leather a deep dark color. Rotten wood produced cold smoke without an open flame, which was critical for preserving the material. The Indians knew that the longer the leather was exposed to smoke, the higher its water-repellent properties. Well-smoked suede could withstand drizzling rain all day long without letting moisture through to the body. Even if it got wet, it remained soft and elastic after drying. Interestingly, this method allowed clothing to breathe, unlike modern rubber raincoats. Moisture from the body escaped to the outside, and raindrops rolled off the fuzzy surface. It was the first membrane fabric in history, created by nature and human ingenuity. The smell of smoke that permeated the clothing also served as protection against insects and masked the smell of humans while hunting. Such clothing lasted for years without losing its unique protective properties. However, smoke was only the final stage of a complex tanning process known as brain tanning. Before smoking, the skin was treated with a mixture of animal brains and water, which made it incredibly soft. The fats penetrated the structure of the skin, replacing water and natural fluids. The skin was then kneaded by hand for a long time and stretched on a frame until it became velvety. Only then was it sent to the smokehouse to fix the result. If such clothing did get soaked through, it was dried in a special way. Under no circumstances should wet leather be placed near an open fire. The heat could cause it to shrink, harden, and become brittle, losing all its properties. The Indians dried their clothes in the shade, in the wind, or away from the fire, constantly kneading them with their hands. This allowed them to retain their softness and restore their water-repellent layer. Smoked leather had another important advantage over regular rawhide. It did not rot or mold, even in the high humidity of the eastern forests. This was critically important for tribes living in regions with frequent rain and fog. Clothing was not just an item, but a tool for survival, which was cherished and constantly maintained. Losing or damaging clothing far from camp could cost a hunter his life. Leather workers were valued in the tribe as much as the best hunters and warriors. The ability to choose the right wood for smoking and determine the smoking time was passed down from generation to generation. Women who were mainly involved in tanning hides knew hundreds of nuances of this craft. The health and comfort of the whole family during the harsh winter months depended on their skill. A well-tanned hide was a convertible currency when trading with other tribes. Even European trappers and settlers quickly appreciated the advantages of Native American clothing. They traded their woolen uniforms and coats for jackets made of smoked deer skin. Cloth would get wet, heavy, and cold, while Native American suede provided better protection. This was a case where indigenous technology surpassed the achievements of Western industry at the time. Smoking leather remains one of the most effective natural ways to waterproof it. We would love to hear your opinion. Do you think modern technology could create something similar without the use of chemicals? Write about it in the comments. What if I told you that everything you believed about cowboy style is not true? We are used to seeing fringe on rock star jackets and in westerns, considering it simply a decorative element. But for Native Americans, each strip of leather had a purely practical, vital significance. Fringe was not a decoration, but a complex drainage system for removing water. It was an ingenious engineering solution based on the laws of physics, which Native Americans knew from experience. When rain falls on a smooth leather surface, the water tends to flow downwards under the force of gravity. If the edge of the garment is flat, water accumulates on it, is absorbed into the seam, and begins to rise upward by capillary action. As a result, the bottom of the jacket or pants quickly becomes heavy, wet, and cold. This leads to hypothermia of the legs and lower back, which is extremely dangerous when hiking. Fringe completely changes the mechanics of water movement on clothing. Water flowing down the surface of the jacket hits these narrow strips of leather and rushes to their tips. This is where physics comes into play. At the thin end of the strip, it is easier for a drop to fall down than to be absorbed back or linger. The fringe worked like 100 small drain pipes, diverting the flow away from the seams in the main part of the garment. The water simply dripped onto the ground without lingering on the edges of the garment. The longer the fringe, the further away from the body the moisture was diverted. This was especially important for tribal seams, which were always the most vulnerable part of any garment. Needle punctures broke the integrity of the skin, and it was through them that water penetrated most quickly. Indians often sewed fringe into the seams on the shoulders and sleeves. This created an additional barrier. Water rolled off the fringe before it could reach the threads. Thus, the most critical areas remained dry much longer. In addition to protecting against rain, the fringe served another important function: accelerated drying. Leather cut into strips had a much larger surface area than a solid piece. The wind blew freely over each strip from all sides, evaporating moisture many times faster. When the rain stopped, the fringe dried first, ceasing to cool the body. A person could dry off on the go simply by continuing to move. The length and density of the fringe varied depending on the climate and region where the tribe lived. Among the tribes of the Great Plains, the fringe was often very long, which helped during heavy rains. For forest peoples, it could be shorter so as not to catch on thick bushes and branches. But the principle remained the same across the continent. It was a universal standard of quality for any hiking clothing. Fringe was made not only on jackets, but also on pants, moccasins, and even weapon covers. On moccasins, the fringe around the ankle prevented water from seeping into the shoe from above. On quivers for arrows, it protected the feathers from getting wet, keeping the weapons ready for action. Every piece of gear was thought out to the smallest detail, taking weather conditions into account. Nothing extra, just pure functionality. Interestingly, when Europeans began wearing leather jackets, they often copied the fringe without understanding its purpose. For them, it became simply a fashion statement, a symbol of the wild frontier life. Over time, the practical meaning was forgotten, and the fringe became a decorative element. But if you look at old museum exhibits, you will see that the fringe is located precisely in the areas where water drains. It is a visual aid for hydrodynamics. Even today, in the age of membranes and impregnations, this principle remains valid and effective. If you find yourself in a leather jacket in the rain, it is the fringe that will save your seams from getting wet. Ancient craftsmen found the solution to the problem without laboratories and formulas, simply by observing nature. Water always seeks the easiest path down, and the fringe gave it that path. In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret of the invisible shield that was applied to clothing, and you will learn what bears have to do with it. Want to know a secret that will change your life if you find yourself in the woods without modern equipment? The Indians knew that tanning alone was not enough to protect against the long autumn rains. To make their clothing truly waterproof, they created an additional protective layer on its surface. The main ingredient of this invisible shield was animal fat, which turned suede into something like oiled canvas. It was an ancient waterproofing technology available to every hunter. Most often, bear, raccoon, or beaver fat was used for this purpose. These animals themselves have thick fur and a layer of subcutaneous fat that protects them from cold water. The Indians melted the fat over a low heat, removing impurities and pieces of meat. The resulting oil was cooled until it thickened, turning it into a dense ointment. Sometimes beeswax or coniferous tree resin was added to the mixture for greater viscosity. The process of applying the impregnation was like a ritual and required great care. The fat was rubbed into the leather with the hands, paying particular attention to the seams and areas subject to the most wear and tear. The warmth of the hands helped the oil to melt and penetrate deep into the pores of the material. The leather darkened before our eyes, becoming heavier and denser. After treatment, the clothes were left in a warm place so that the composition would be absorbed evenly. This impregnation worked by repelling water molecules. Raindrops that fell on the greasy surface did not spread, but gathered into balls and rolled down. Even if water remained in the folds of the clothing, the oily barrier prevented it from soaking into the fibers. This allowed the wearer to stay dry even when walking through wet bushes or tall grass. In fact, it was similar to modern fabric waxing. Special attention was paid to footwear, which was in constant contact with moisture. Moccasins were soaked in fat so thoroughly that they became almost waterproof. In winter, this protected them from melting snow, and in summer, from morning dew. However, this method had a significant drawback. The fat clogged the pores of the leather, preventing it from breathing. Feet sweated in such shoes, so the impregnation was used wisely and only when necessary. The smell of rancid fat was a constant companion of such clothing. For modern people, this aroma would seem unbearable, but for the people of that time, it was the smell of safety and warmth. Moreover, over time, they got used to it and stopped noticing it. In some cases, fragrant herbs such as sage or lavender were added to the fat to refine the aroma a little, but functionality always came first. The fat impregnation also extended the life of leather goods. It prevented the material from drying out and cracking in the sun and wind. The leather remained elastic even after repeated wetting and drying. Without regular lubrication, suede quickly became stiff and brittle. Caring for clothing was as routine as cleaning weapons or sharpening knives. On long hunts, hunters always carried a small supply of fat in a bladder or horn. If it started to rain, they could quickly renew the protection on their shoulders and hoods. It was a kind of first aid kit for clothing. The ability to notice in time that the leather was beginning to absorb water and take action distinguished an experienced survivalist. Nature provided all the necessary components. One only needed to know how to use them. Some tribes used animal brains not only for tanning, but also as an express impregnation. Raw brain contains a huge amount of fats and emulsifiers. If there was no time to melt pure fat, the skin could simply be rubbed with brain matter. It was less durable, but it worked as a temporary measure in an emergency. The use of fats was a universal practice from the Arctic to the southern deserts. Only the sources of fat differed. In some places it was seal, in others bison, and in others deer. The principle of hydrophobic coating was understood by all cultures living in close contact with nature. It was simple but effective Stone Age chemistry, called alike. Are you ready for the shocking truth about what killed travelers faster than the cold? Wet feet and sub-zero temperatures were a death sentence, leading to frostbite and gangrene. For Native Americans, keeping their feet dry was the #1 priority, because without the ability to walk, a person became a burden to the tribe. Moccasins, the main footwear of indigenous peoples, were ingeniously simple but required a complex system of use to withstand moisture. Leather moccasins, even when well smoked and greased, still got wet over time. This was especially true for the soft soles, which were constantly in contact with damp ground, snow, and wet grass. Therefore, Native Americans never relied on just one pair of shoes. On a long journey, A warrior always took several spare pairs of moccasins with him, as well as pieces of leather for emergency repairs. Changing shoes was a mandatory procedure at the earliest opportunity. The main secret to keeping feet dry was to insulate them from the moccasin leather itself. A thick layer of dry grass, moss, or bison wool was placed inside the shoes. This insole created an air gap that retained heat and absorbed moisture from the feet or seeping in from outside. If the grass got wet, it was simply thrown away and replaced with fresh grass, which was abundant on the prairie. It was a disposable, hygienic, and free insulator. In winter, special high moccasins were used, which were tied over the trouser legs. This prevented snow from getting inside the shoes when walking through snowdrifts. Snow that fell on bare skin melted from body heat and instantly wet the shoes from the inside. The tightness of the upper part was as important as the waterproofness of the sole. The seams on winter shoes were made with particular care, often lining them with a strip of rawhide. If the moccasins did get wet through, they had to be dried very carefully. Like clothing, shoes could not be placed close to the fire. The Indians stuffed wet moccasins with hot sand or pebbles heated over a fire. The stones gave off heat from the inside, drying the leather gently and evenly, preventing it from shrinking. This method allowed shoes to be dried even in wet weather when the sun did not appear for days. Tribes living in more humid regions had special shoe covers. Rough sandals woven from stiff yucca fibers or bark were worn over soft moccasins. They lifted the foot above the mud and wet ground, working like modern galoshes. This significantly extended the life of the leather sole and kept the feet dry, a simple solution that increased passability many times over. Special attention was paid to hygiene and the condition of the skin on the feet. The Indians regularly lubricated their feet with fat, creating a protective film directly on the body. This reduced the risk of diaper rash and fungal diseases that develop in a moist environment. The fat also reduced heat loss, acting as an extra layer of clothing. Hardened feet were less sensitive to cold and dampness. In wet snow or slush, moccasins were not worn at all if it was possible to stay in camp. But if it was necessary to walk, skins with fur on the inside were used. Bison or deer fur excellently retained warm air and wick moisture away from the skin. Even if the outside got wet, the inside remained dry. This technology later became the basis for modern boots. The women of the tribe were constantly engaged in repairing and making shoes. A good wife had to provide her husband with enough moccasins for a military campaign or hunting. This was considered a sign of care and love. Bad shoes could cause the entire expedition to fail. Therefore, the art of sewing moccasins was honed by girls from early childhood. The experience of the Indians shows that keeping your feet dry is not a matter of one super material, but a system of actions. It is a combination of changeable shoes, proper insulation, fat impregnation, and proper drying. They understood that there is no such thing as absolute waterproofing and learned to manage moisture. In the next chapter, you will learn how plants replaced umbrellas and raincoats. We often forget that leather was not the only material available to indigenous peoples. In regions where it rained for weeks on end, such as the northwest coast or the forests of the east, leather clothing was impractical because it took too long to dry. This is where plants came to the rescue. Native Americans created amazing capes and raincoats from plant fibers that worked like a tiled roof. Craftsmen wove dense mats and capes from cedar bark, reeds, cattails, and prairie grasses. The secret lay in a special weaving technique. Bundles of grass or strips of bark were laid in layers so that the top row overlapped the bottom row. Water falling on such a cape simply rolled down the stiff fibers without penetrating inside. This was the same technology used in the construction of house roofs. Cedar bark was a particularly valuable material due to its natural oils. It did not rot, repelled insects, and had excellent water-repellent properties. The bark was stripped from trees in long strips, soaked and kneaded until it became soft fibers. These fibers were woven into cloaks that were light, durable, and completely waterproof. In such a cloak, one could sit in a canoe in the pouring rain for hours. Cloaks made of reeds and cattails were coarser but no less effective. The hollow structure of the stems of these plants provided excellent thermal insulation. The air inside the stems prevented the cold rain from cooling the body. Such a plant raincoat worked like a thermos, retaining the person's heat and not letting moisture in. It was a cheap and affordable solution for any member of the tribe. These capes were usually cone-shaped, with an opening for the head. This allowed water to drain evenly from all sides without getting down the collar. The hands often remained under the cape, warm and dry, and were only exposed when necessary. This design minimized the number of seams and openings through which water could penetrate. The simplicity of the shape guaranteed reliable protection. These cloaks had another advantage. They dried very quickly. It was enough to shake the cape and hang it in the wind, and in half an hour it was ready for use. Unlike leather, plant fibers did not absorb water into their structure. Moisture remained only on the surface. This made them indispensable in conditions of constant dampness and fog. In addition to clothing, wide hats were woven from plants. The woven hats of the northwestern tribes were cone-shaped and worked like an umbrella, protecting the head and shoulders. The brims of the hats kept water away from the face, allowing the wearer to see and navigate even in a downpour. The weave was so dense that the hat could be used as a container for carrying water. Grass capes were often used as a temporary solution. A hunter caught in a thunderstorm on the steppe could quickly weave a simple cape from tall grass. This required no tools, only dexterity and knowledge of knots. The ability to use what grew underfoot was an essential survival skill. Nature itself provided shelter to those who knew how to take it. Of course, plant-based clothing was less durable than leather and wore out faster, but its ease of repair and the availability of materials compensated for this disadvantage. A broken branch or bunch of grass could be replaced in a minute. It was the ideal clothing for a humid climate, where leather quickly became unusable. The use of plant materials shows how flexible the thinking of indigenous peoples was. They did not focus on a single technology, but chose what was best suited to specific conditions. If leather did not work, they turned to grass and bark. This pragmatism helped them survive in all climatic zones. What if I told you that the best protection against a blizzard weighs as much as a person? For the Plains Indians, bison hide was everything. A home, a bed, and, of course, the main winter clothing. The bison is an animal created by nature to survive in the most extreme conditions, and its hide inherits these properties. A bison cape, or robe, was heavy but impenetrable armor against the icy wind and wet snow. The secret to the effectiveness of bison hide lay in its incredible density and fur structure. The undercoat of a bison is so dense that snow on the animal's back does not melt from its body heat. This means that the thermal insulation is perfect. The Indians used this property by wrapping themselves in the skins with the fur inside. Warm air was trapped between the fibers, creating a microclimate around the person, like the tropics in the middle of the winter steppe. The outer side of the skin, the leather, was carefully treated. It was often painted with geometric patterns, which in addition to their sacred meaning, also had practical significance. Paints mixed with fat and glue created an additional water-repellent layer. The smooth outer surface allowed snow and water to roll off without sticking to the cape. It was the principle of a modern sheepskin coat, only much more powerful. Wearing such a heavy garment was not easy, so bison capes were mainly used for sedentary activities. Guards on duty, old people in the camp, or people riding horses wrapped themselves in them from head to toe. They were too cumbersome for active hunting or combat. In such cases, they were discarded or replaced with lighter deerskins. It was clothing for strategic purposes. Interestingly, in winter, the skin was worn with the fur against the body, and in rain it was sometimes turned inside out. The thick pile worked like a thatched roof. Water ran off the top layer of wool without penetrating the skin. In nature, bisons stand in the rain and do not get wet, and humans use the same mechanism of protection. This required an understanding of the properties of fur and the ability to adapt to the situation. Old worn skins were not thrown away. They were used to make bedding, hang over the entrance to a teepee, or as extra blankets. The older the skin, the softer it became, losing its water-repellent properties, but retaining its ability to keep warm. Each item had its own life cycle and served people until it completely fell apart. A bison cape also served as a sleeping bag. When camping, a warrior could lie directly on the snow wrapped in a robe. The thick leather insulated him from the cold ground, and the fur retained body heat. If snow fell on top, it created additional insulation, like in a den. It was only thanks to this skin that a person could survive the night in an open field at sub-zero temperatures. Women's capes were slightly lighter and more carefully crafted, often decorated with porcupine quills. But functionally, they were no different from men's. Children were often carried on the back under such a cape, where they were warmed by the heat of their mother and the fur at the same time. The bison hide united the family, protecting it from the outside world. With the disappearance of the bison, an entire era in clothing culture came to an end. The wool blankets that the Indians began to receive from traders, although lighter, could not compare with bison hides in terms of protective properties. The blanket got wet and lost its warmth, while the hide kept you warm even when wet. It was a loss of technology that could not be compensated for by factory-made goods. Bison hides are an example of perfect adaptation to the environment. The Indians did not try to fight nature. They borrowed solutions from those who had lived in this environment for millions of years. If a bison is not afraid of a storm, then a person wearing its hide may not be afraid of it either. How comfortable do you think a modern person would be in such clothing, weighing 10 to 15 kilograms? Dry clothing is not only what you wear, but also where you dry it. Native American dwellings, whether the conical teepees of the plains or the longhouses of the Iroquois, were designed as ideal drying chambers. The teepee's design, with a smoke hole at the top, created a powerful draft that not only drew out smoke, but also ensured constant circulation of warm air. This allowed things to dry very quickly, even in damp weather. Inside the teepee, there was a strict system for storing things. Wet clothes were never piled up in a heap. In the upper part of the dwelling, where the warmest and driest air collected, ropes made of sinew or straps were stretched. Wet jackets and moccasins were hung there. The heat rising from the central hearth passed through the items, drying them gently and effectively without the risk of overheating. A special feature of the teepee was the inner lining, called the ozon or wall. It was a strip of leather or fabric that ran around the perimeter of the interior of the dwelling at human height. This lining created an air gap between the outer covering and the living space. If water seeped through the top opening or ran down the poles during a rainstorm, it fell behind this lining and drained into the ground without dripping on people or bedding. In the longhouses of the Iroquois, where dozens of families lived, the space under the roof was filled with food supplies and firewood, but there was also room for drying. Constantly burning hearths created a dry microclimate under the bark-covered roof. The elm bark used to cover the houses swelled and compacted when wet, sealing the cracks. It was a self-regulating waterproofing system. The hearth was the heart of the house and the main tool for combating dampness. The Indians knew how to maintain the fire so that it gave off a lot of heat and little smoke, or vice versa if it was necessary to smoke the clothes again. The stones around the hearth heated up and continued to give off heat throughout the night, drying the air. The humidity inside the dwelling was always lower than outside, which prevented the growth of mold. The floor in a teepee or wigwam was also prepared in a special way. The ground was tamped down and covered with a thick layer of spruce branches, skins, or woven mats. This created insulation from the damp soil. Even if water seeped inside, it drained through the branches, leaving the surface dry. Sleeping areas were always raised above ground level on wooden bunks or thick mattresses. Interestingly, the entrance to the teepee was always located to the east, with its back to the prevailing westerly winds. This prevented rain and snow from blowing inside when the door was open. The cone shape was ideal for wind resistance, and raindrops rolled down the sloping walls at maximum speed. The aerodynamics of the dwelling worked to keep the interior dry. On rainy days, life did not stop, but moved indoors. Women did needlework, men repaired weapons while sitting by the fire. This time was used to care for clothing, impregnating it with fat, repairing seams. The dwelling was not just a shelter, but a workshop for restoring equipment. The ability to quickly set up camp and light a fire in the rain was a critical skill. The Indians carried dry tinder in waterproof pouches under their clothes. They could get a fire going and create a warm area in a matter of minutes. Without this skill, no clothing could protect them from prolonged dampness. Native American architecture was entirely functional. There was nothing superfluous. Every detail served the purpose of survival. Teepees and longhouses were complex engineering structures that allowed people to live in comfort in the middle of the wilderness. They were oases of dryness in an ocean of inclement weather. Technology is important, but human behavior is even more important. The Indians knew that the best way to stay dry was not to get wet unless absolutely necessary. They had incredible patience and an ability to read nature. If a storm was approaching, they did not try to outrun it, risking exhaustion and getting wet. They found shelter under overhanging rocks, thick fir trees, or simply set up a temporary canopy and waited. Rushing in the rain causes a person to sweat. For Native Americans, sweat under clothing in winter was as dangerous as rain outside. Clothes that are wet on the inside lose their thermal insulation. Therefore, during their journeys, they moved at a steady pace, avoiding overheating. If it got hot, they took off extra layers or unbuttoned their clothes to cool down. Regulating body temperature was an art. They knew how to use the terrain to protect themselves from wind and precipitation. Trails were not laid along open ridges where the wind blows through, but along leeward slopes and lowlands. They knew where to find dry deadwood for a fire, even after a week of rain. They looked for the lower dry branches of coniferous trees or the core of rotten stumps. During rain, their gait also changed. The Indians tried not to touch wet bushes and tall grass so as not to shake water onto themselves. They walked in single file so that the first person would knock off the dew and water, and those walking behind would stay drier. It was a collective movement tactic that conserved the group's resources. If they did get wet, they never stayed in wet clothes overnight. The rule was ironclad. Before going to bed, you had to undress, wring out and dry your clothes, or put on dry ones. Sleeping naked in a dry fur skin is warmer than in wet clothes. Body heat reflected by fur warms better than any fabric. Psychological resilience played a huge role. Indians were accustomed to discomfort from childhood and did not panic when caught in the rain. They knew how to endure cold and dampness while keeping a clear mind. Panic causes you to make mistakes, run, sweat, and lose strength. Calmness preserved energy and warmth. They also used natural oils not only for clothing, but also for the body. By rubbing fat into their skin before going out into the cold and rain, they created an additional protective barrier. Water rolled off the skin, and the fat reduced heat loss. This allowed them to get by with a minimum of clothing during active pursuits such as hunting or fighting. Observing animals gave them the right strategies. Just as deer hide in thickets before a storm, people sought natural shelters. They were part of the ecosystem and lived according to its rhythms, not against them. This harmony with nature was the key to survival. The ability to predict the weather based on signs gave them a head start. Changes in the wind, bird behavior, the color of the sunset, all these were signals to prepare. They managed to find shelter and gather firewood before the first drops fell. Knowledge is also a tool for protection from rain. Ultimately, staying dry was not achieved by a single miracle technology, but by a combination of measures: the right clothing, proper shelter, movement tactics, and psychological attitude. It was a whole philosophy of life in the wild. Winter in the endless Great Plains and harsh forests of the subarctic presented people with completely different challenges than the prolonged autumn rains. There is a surprising paradox. It was much easier to stay dry in winter if you clearly understood the difference between dry and wet cold. Snow at very low temperatures is not moisture at all, but a solid and dry substance resembling fine sand in its properties. The main task of the Indians was to prevent this snow from melting directly on their clothes from the heat of the human body. Therefore, fur garments were worn with the fur inside and the smooth, carefully processed leather outside, so that snowflakes simply slid down and did not get stuck in the thick pile. Before entering a warm and cozy dwelling, there was a mandatory and sacred ritual. It was necessary to shake off every last grain of snow from one's clothing. For this important purpose, special beaters carved from the bone of a large animal or sturdy wood were used. If you entered the teepee without cleaning your clothes, the snow would instantly melt in the warmth of the hearth and be deeply absorbed into the pores of your skin. The next time you went outside, this moisture would freeze again in the icy wind, turning your flexible clothing into a stiff and heavy ice shell that would no longer keep you warm. Discipline in this matter was ironclad, because the hunter's life that night depended on the cleanliness of his jacket. During periods of severe frost, moisture, which inevitably evaporates from the body even at rest, condensed on the cold outer surface of the clothing in the form of frost. This white coating also had to be regularly and very carefully scraped off so that it would not begin to melt from the sun's rays or the heat of the fire. Winter clothing had to breathe as efficiently as possible, removing all vapors to the outside. That is why winter parkas and wide pants were sewn very loosely so that warm air could circulate freely inside, naturally removing excess moisture. Such ventilation was the key secret to why the Indians did not freeze to the bone after active running. To protect against treacherous wet snow and spring slush, they used mukluks, tall boots with stiff soles and uppers made of sealskin or impregnated moose hide. The peoples of the far north learned to sew incredibly light and surprisingly warm parkas, even from bird skins or the intestines of large marine animals. The Indians always paid special attention to reliable protection for their hands, without which survival on the prairie would be impossible. Warm mittens were sewn from beaver or otter skins, as their fur is naturally very resistant to moisture and ice. Mittens were often hung on a sturdy leather cord slung around the neck so that they could be quickly removed for delicate work and not lost in deep snow. Quickly drying frozen hands against the body, under the armpits or on the stomach, was a basic skill that children were taught from an early age. The ability to quickly restore blood circulation to the fingers saved thousands of lives during winter storms. Winter clothing has always been multi-layered, allowing for flexibility in adapting to any weather changes. The bottom layer consisted of soft, finely crafted leather that effectively absorbed sweat, and the top layer was made of thick fur that protected against the icy wind. The ability to combine these layers allowed hunters to perfectly regulate their body temperature and humidity while on the move. In essence, it was a prototype of the modern sports system consisting of thermal underwear, fleece, and a membrane. Ancient people achieved such perfection in clothing that we are only now beginning to truly appreciate. The main secret to staying dry in winter is the art of finely controlling your own body heat. It was necessary to prevent snow from melting on the outside and sweat from condensing inside the clothing. This delicate balance required constant attention, discipline, and vast life experience from each person. The Indians were true masters of thermoregulation, able to survive and raise children where others would inevitably perish from cold and dampness within a few hours. To conclude our immersion in the world of ancient technologies, it is worth mentioning the most important tool of the Native Americans, their unique minds. All these ingenious inventions, smoking leather, fringes on clothing, the use of fat, and the construction of teepees, would have been completely useless without a special philosophy of life. The Indians never perceived heavy rain or freezing cold as a personal enemy or simply bad weather. For them, it was a natural part of the great world, as familiar and necessary as the summer sun or green grass. They accepted any discomfort as a given, without wasting their mental energy on useless complaints or discontent. Modern people often fall into a state of severe stress if their feet get wet on a walk. The Indian calmly noted this fact as a fait accompli and immediately took the necessary action. He changed the dry grass in his moccasins, lit a small fire, or simply waited patiently until evening. A very high pain threshold and iron psychological fortitude allowed them to completely ignore such inconveniences, which would instantly break the will of any pampered city dweller. Fortitude was their first and most reliable layer of protection against any adversity. The process of hardening began in early childhood and was an integral part of their upbringing. Children often ran barefoot in the first snow and bathed in the icy waters of mountain rivers alongside adults. This not only trained their blood vessels, but also taught their young bodies to restore their disturbed heat balance incredibly quickly. The Indian's body itself became a powerful heating tool, capable of generating energy in extreme conditions. Dry and warm clothing was only a faithful assistant to them, not the only protection from the aggressive environment. They possessed an amazing ability to find benefit and even joy in deep dampness or heavy fog. Rain effectively washed away all human smells, allowing the hunter to get much closer to sensitive animals than usual. Fresh snow perfectly revealed all traces, and the sound of strong wind drowned out the warrior's footsteps. They masterfully used any weather conditions to their advantage, turning obvious disadvantages into strategic advantages. A hunter in a soaking wet leather jacket was deadly dangerous because at such moments he became virtually invisible and inaudible to his prey. This profound philosophy did not mean a complete rejection of life's comforts or conveniences. On the contrary, the Indians loved the warmth of home, soft beds made of skins, and hot, delicious food by the fire. But they never made comfort their highest priority or became slaves to it. They were ready at any moment to instantly give up all comforts for an important goal. Whether it was a big hunt, protecting the tribe, or an urgent migration to a new place, the ability to instantly switch from home comfort mode to extreme survival mode was their real superpower, unavailable to many other peoples. European travelers were often amazed at how Indians could sit half naked by the fire for long periods of time in the most severe frost. The secret here was not some kind of magic, but the fact that they preferred to warm their bodies directly with the radiant heat of the fire without creating a barrier of wet clothing between their skin and the flames. Sometimes it is much better and more correct to be completely naked and dry right by the fire than to remain dressed and wet away from it. This deep understanding of the laws of thermodynamics allowed them to recover their strength much faster than white people did in their heavy woolen uniforms. We can truly learn a lot from these peoples today, and it's not just about how to properly grease your boots, but also about how to remain completely calm when everything goes wrong. After all, dryness is not only a state of your clothes, but also of your inner spirit. The history of indigenous peoples convincingly proves that humans are capable of successfully adapting to anything if they have the will and knowledge. They conquered this harsh continent not in spite of the wild nature, but in deep alliance with it. We have seen that moisture protection among the indigenous peoples of North America was a complex science. It was a combination of chemistry, smoking and greasing, physics, fringing in the shape of dwellings, biology, the use of the properties of fur and plants, and psychology. They did not have laboratories, but through observation and experimentation, they created technologies that worked effectively for centuries. Their clothing was like a second skin, alive and breathable, perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions of the plains and forests. Modern membranes and synthetics largely copy the principles discovered by the Indians. Layering, moisture wicking, hydrophobic impregnations. All of this was invented long before us. Only instead of plastic, they used skins, and instead of chemical sprays, they used bear fat and campfire smoke. This legacy teaches us to respect the wisdom of the past and to see nature not as an enemy, but as a teacher. Which of these ancient technologies did you find most ingenious or unexpected? Was it the function of fringe or the use of brains for tanning? Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new dives into the history of survival.